Victor Fröhlicher had prospered during the Great Depression. The Swiss-born chemist and his wife, Helen, bought a gracious new slate-roofed home on a tree-lined street in Ridgewood, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. They raised 5 children on its half-acre lawn and hosted endless events within its plastered halls. Holiday socials, buffet lunches, community meetings, and concerts. Victor played the organ and directed their church choir. Helen raised funds for charity. Their lives felt full and generous. Fröhlicher owed his prosperity to the textile dyeing and printing company, which had a plant in nearby Fairlawn, where he was chief chemist. Textiles were big business. Even during the Depression, their production and consumption rose. As the national economy recovered, though, struggles between management and unions rattled the company. In 1938, the Fairlawn plant shuttered, and Fröhlicher was out of work. He traveled back to Switzerland, leaving his family behind, in hopes of finding new work to support them. Before a year had passed, he was back in the States with a new job. He was the U.S. representative for the reputable Swiss chemical company, J.R. Geigy, which had been looking to expand its reach into the U.S. market for decades. Geigy was one of the oldest and most successful of the big dye companies in Europe, founded all the way back in 1758, when it began as a manufacturer and trader of not just dyes, but also spices, drugs, and other chemicals. A century later, the company joined a pack of German firms that began making dyes and drugs from coal tar, an abundant waste product of the Industrial Revolution. It was a booming business. By the late 1800s, Geigy had sales offices in Europe, Asia, and North America. In the early 1900s, Geigy began setting up plants in the United States. By the late 1930s, just as the textile dyeing and printing company was shutting down in Fairlawn, Geigy was closing its own plant in Jersey City, but only to build a much bigger plant in Bayonne. The company also had plans to erect a research lab next door to the new Bayonne plant. This new plant, Geigy planned, would focus on the next big thing in chemistry, compounds that killed insect pests. Insects had assumed pest-scale proportions for more than half a century by then. Massive changes in U.S. farming and transportation in the late 19th century had invited a long list of destructive bugs: the Colorado potato beetle, boll weevil, gypsy moth, codling moth, cotton armyworm, plum curculio, and countless others. White cabbage butterflies destroyed cabbage crops. Joint worms wiped out wheat crops. Rocky Mountain locusts devastated just about everything in their paths, sometimes swarming so thick that they slowed trains on newly laid tracks. Farmers picked insects off plants by hand, shook them off wheeled carts, and crushed them with blocks and bricks. They loosed natural parasites and predators of the pests, sometimes creating bigger problems in the process. Desperate, they also applied poisonous chemicals, especially lead arsenate and the copper arsenic compound known as Paris green. The poisons were effective. Straight arsenic killed the cereal-destroying armyworm. A sprinkling of Paris green could kill half the locusts in a field. They had just one problem. Their residues clung to crops. And on crops eaten fresh, like fruits and vegetables, such residues could sicken and kill. By the 1920s, unwitting consumers began to fall ill, left shaking with fever, bloody urine, and thready pulse after eating asparagus, cabbage, celery, or the like. Some, like the Montana girl who ate 3 apples in a row, ended up dead. Journalists reported that people were refusing to touch green commodities. Doctors warned of a menace to the public health. By the time Fröhlicher stepped into his new role at Geigy, there was a frenzied search for a generation of insecticides that killed pests, but not people. Geigy's Bayonne lab was still relatively new when World War II began, but its mandate was already clear. Insects weren't just a threat to agriculture. They were a menace in war, too. They feasted on the destruction left by combat and were drawn to hordes of soldiers and refugees in crowded, unsanitary conditions.